The galaxy is a graveyard of empires, its stars burning like watchful eyes over the endless wars of man and monster. Yet within that darkness, there were once beings who carried the spark of something greater than mortal flesh. Figures who strode across battlefields as if they were gods made manifest. They were the Primarchs, the Emperor's lost sons, and wherever their footsteps fell, the very ground seemed to tremble with destiny. Some would become saviors of entire systems, others the architects of mankind's greatest betrayals, but all bore within them a power that could never truly be caged. To speak of a Primarch unleashed is to glimpse not only strength beyond comprehension, but the shadow of what humanity itself might have become if not for the tragedies that split the Imperium in two. And before we plunge deeper into this saga, let me ask one thing of you, wanderer of the digital void. If the fire of this universe grips you, if you find your pulse quickening with every echo of bolter fire and whispered him to the Emperor, then lend your strength to this channel. Like, share, and subscribe not for numbers on a screen, but so that together we may keep alive the tales of mankind's eternal struggle among the stars. They were born not in the gentle light of terror's dawn, but in the silence of vaults where the Emperor's genius burned like a secret sun. The Primarchs were not accidents of chance, nor children born of mortal wombs. They were designs etched into existence, living symphonies of gene-forged perfection. Each carried within him a spark of the Emperor's own boundless will, sculpted with purpose so immense that even the stars seemed like lesser things beside them. Yet destiny is rarely so kind as to deliver creation into the hands of its creator. For when they were still infants in their stasis cradles, the warp itself took notice. That realm of madness and hunger reached forth, scattering the Emperor's sons across the galaxy in a storm of howling unreality. One moment they were secure within laboratories and vaults, where no flaw dared to creep. The next they were flung like meteors across worlds alien and hostile. No one truly knows what hand guided that dispersal, whether it was pure chance, the deliberate sabotage of powers beyond mortal reckoning, or the cruel laughter of the gods of chaos. What is known is only this: each Primarch awoke far from terror, far from the golden light of their father, alone in a galaxy that neither recognized nor deserved them. Imagine the child who can lift stone, where men break their backs, whose eyes pierce the darkness like burning coals, whose voice commands obedience without needing to be raised. Such children do not pass unnoticed, and their worlds bent around them like iron to a magnet. On some planets, they became saviors. On others, they became tyrants. The soil of each world stained their souls as much as their souls bent the fate of the soil. Vulcan was raised in fire, Pharis Manus among the unyielding forges, Angron in the blood-soaked arenas of slavery. These were not merely childhoods. They were crucibles, and in every crucible a weapon was sharpened. There was loneliness in it too. For though each was surrounded by mortals who called them master, savior, or monster, no Primarch found a peer in those early years. To live among men, yet never be of them, is a burden few can comprehend. They were gods caged in mortal shells, yearning for something they could not name, the presence of their brothers, the call of their father. Across the void, unknowing, they dreamed of belonging, even as they carved empires, even as they bled in arenas, even as they knelt in prayer to gods who would never answer. And still, the Emperor sought them, with fleets of lightning and iron, with legions bred for war. He stretched his hand across the galaxy, not only to reunite with his sons, but to bind them to the dream of Imperium. Yet when father and son met again, it was never as blank slates. Each Primarch came already scarred, already shaped by a destiny that had written itself in fire and loss. The Emperorâ had built weapons, the warp had raised men, and in that tension lay the seed of all that was to come. The first reunions were triumphs sung across worlds, legions falling to their knees as father embraced son. But beneath the hymns and banners, an unspoken truth gnawed. The sons who returned were not simply creations, they were sovereigns in their own right. They had known power, loyalty, and betrayal long before terror's banners flew over their worlds. To ask them to kneel was to ask them to surrender not only pride but the very identities forged in exile. And it is there, in that fragile silence between embrace and command, that history begins to tremble. The moment of reunion was not merely the return of a lost son to his father. It was a clash of sovereignties. A Primarch did not kneel easily, for each had already become the center of a world. When Lament was found, he was already a king among the icebound tribes of Fenris, feared and worshipped as a wolf god whose howl carried across the fjords like a storm. When Guilliman stood before the Emperor, he did so as the ruler of Macragge, master of an ordered realm that rivaled terror itself in discipline and prosperity. These were not children reclaimed. They were lords, each with the weight of entire civilizations bound to them. To fold such pride into obedience required more than love. It demanded vision, and it demanded control. Yet the Emperor was not simply a father. He was a figure so vast in will and intellect that even his sons felt themselves lesser in his presence. In those first embraces there was warmth, yes, but beneath it, the shadow of inevitability. The Emperor did not gather them out of yearning alone. He gathered them to wield them. For the Great Crusade had already begun, and the Primarchs were not to be hidden away in palaces or temples. They were the warlords who would spearhead conquest, the generals who would bring light and fire to the dark corners of the galaxy. Still, the human heart cannot be excised even from gene-forged beings. Some Primarchs longed desperately for the recognition of the father they had dreamed of, and in that recognition they found fuel for endless loyalty. Horus, the brightest of them all, burned with such devotion that men who witnessed his bond with the Emperor swore it was like watching the sun embrace its reflection. Others, however, felt the weight of subtle distance. Perturabo, architect and warrior both, could never shake the sense that he was measured against impossible expectations. His triumphs reduced to cold calculations in his father's gaze. Kurz, haunted by visions of doom, saw in the Emperor not salvation but confirmation of his darkest fears, and yet, together, they marched. The Legiones Astartes, once directed by distant commanders, now knew the presence of their gene. To fight under a Primarch was to step into the orbit of a living demigod. Their warriors did not simply obey orders. They were inspired, compelled, elevated. Armies that might falter at the jaws of alien beasts or the fortified walls of Xenos strongholds found themselves unstoppable when their Primarch roared from the front lines. But always, beneath the banners and the thunder of conquest, there was the silence of the warp's touch. For though the Primarchs stood now with their father, the warp had claimed a part of them long before. Its whispers lingered in the recesses of their souls, its chaos stitched into their destinies. No matter how brightly the Emperor's dream blazed, the shadow of that scattering never lifted. Each son carried within him both the brilliance of creation and the taint of exile, and the galaxy, vast and merciless, watched them rise. Worlds fell in reverence, others in terror, as the names of the Primarchs spread like fire. Yet with every triumph, with every oath sworn beneath the twin-headed Aquila, the question grew sharper. Could sons who had once ruled alone truly bind themselves forever to a father who demanded not only loyalty, but submission? The answer, though hidden then in the thunder of victories, was already beginning to bleed through. The Great Crusade thundered onward, and with every campaign, the Primarchs became more than commanders. They were legends incarnate, each one reshaping the battlefield by the sheer gravity of his presence. Where dawn-fortified cities became bastions, where Con rode, the winds of his white scars turned wastelands into lightning storms of cavalry and engines. Sanguinius, angel-winged and radiant, brought hope that felt almost divine, his mere silhouette enough to turn despair into exultation. To witness a Primarch unleashed was to understand that these were not mortals lifted above men, but forces of nature clothed in flesh. Yet even among such brilliance, the fractures grew. Brothers did not always see eye to eye, for each had been sculpted by worlds apart, tempered by cultures and cruelties beyond terror's comprehension. Mortarion, raised in the choking mists of Barbaroos, despised weakness and indulgence, while Fulgrim, whose eye craved perfection, saw beauty as the highest form of truth. To march side by side was to invite inevitable collision, though for a time, the Emperor's vision bound them together in something greater than themselves. They spoke of unity, of destiny, of mankind's rise toward dominion over the stars, but beneath the banners of conquest. Whispers of pride and rivalry flickered like sparks waiting for fuel, for the mortal warriors who followed them. The Primarchs were both miracle and terror. An Imperial guardsman might go his entire life hearing only rumors of such beings. Stories traded in hushed awe across campfires on distant frontiers. But to see one in the flesh was to feel the ground quake with every step, to smell the ozone as their blades carved through alien war engines, to hear their voices echo across vox channels like thunder given language. It was to believe, for a fleeting heartbeat, that humanity might truly be destined for godhood. And yet, it was also to realize how far beyond humans such beings stood. They were not brothers in arms to their soldiers. They were burning suns that could not be approached without blindness. The Emperor knew this. Perhaps he always knew that such power, scattered and reclaimed, could never remain entirely within his grasp. But still he pressed forward. Still he demanded loyalty without question, as though love and obedience could be drawn together by sheer force of will. For many sons, that demand became a wound hidden beneath armor and triumph. How could one who had ruled, who had been worshipped, who had carved his fate from the bones of hostile worlds, truly surrender all he had become? Even then, in the years of glory, the answer whispered itself in the silence between victories. The warp had not scattered the Primarchs without purpose. Its corruption lingered, unseen but waiting, and the very power that made them humanity's saviors would one day drive them toward ruin. Some sensed it in their dreams, visions of blood and betrayal that stained even their brightest triumphs. Others drowned it in conquest, refusing to hear the murmurs beneath the hymns of loyalty. But the shadow remained, for in the hearts of gods shaped as men, pride was never far from pain, and pride, in time, would prove sharper than any blade. The first chapter closes not with certainty, but with unease. The sons of the Emperor reunited, yet carrying within them the seeds of both salvation and heresy. The galaxy shuddered beneath their march, and the question lingered like a wound. What happens when the godlike power of a Primarch is no longer bound by love, but by rebellion? The galaxy is a crucible of flame, and in the age of the Great Crusade, that crucible rang with the footsteps of giants. Where once the stars were scattered realms of alien dominion, heretic strongholds, and fractured human empires, the Primarchs now marched at the head of the Legiones. Entire fleets shuddered beneath their command, and planets that had resisted imperial truth for millennia found their skies burning within weeks of a Primarch's arrival. To fight under such a leader was to feel as though the Emperor himself had descended, a fragment of his unstoppable will made flesh. There are stories told in half-broken Vox recordings, fragments preserved in data slates carried across centuries, that speak of what it was like when a Primarch entered the theater of war. Imagine an army teetering on the brink of collapse, surrounded by foes whose numbers blacken the horizon. Despair coils in every heart, fear spreading like infection. Then, through the storm, a figure appears, storing, armored in plate that gleams like the wrath of the machine god, eyes alight with something beyond human fire. His voice booms across the battlefield, not through amplification, but through sheer force of presence. Men who had faltered rise again, weapons steady. A charge that should have broken dissolves into victory, because a single demigod stood at the center and refused to fall. Some Primarchs led with a strategist's precision, sculpting the flow of battle as though they were master artisans shaping stone. Guilliman's every maneuver was a lesson in order, his formations so flawless that enemies found themselves crushed not by overwhelming force but by inevitability. Others led with the primal fury of unleashed storms. Russ hurled himself into the thickest fighting, tearing through enemy champions with a savagery that turned the tide not through strategy, but through the awe and terror his example unleashed. And still others brought with them something stranger, something almost spiritual. When Sanguinius unfurled his wings upon the battlefield, soldiers swore they saw not a Primarch, but an angel. A vision that made them believe the Emperor's light would never falter. But war, no matter how glorious in song, is never without its shadows. For all their brilliance, the Primarchs were not simply weapons of conquest. They were individuals, burdened by the scars of their exile, and each campaign reflected those scars. Mortarian's campaigns suffocated worlds in relentless attrition, echoing the deathly mists of his childhood. Perturabo left behind fortresses of steel and ruin, monuments to his bitterness as much as to his genius. Angron carved paths of victory at such a cost of life that his own warriors often wondered whether their triumphs were victories or massacres. The Emperor had unleashed his sons upon the galaxy, but he had not erased what the warp had written into their hearts. Still, the galaxy trembled. Civilizations older than Terra's memory fell one by one before the hammer blows of the Primarchs. Xenos empires that had once believed themselves eternal were swept aside as though they were dust before a storm. For the mortals who followed, there was awe, pride, even worship, but also fear, an unspoken dread of what it meant that such beings now held the fate of worlds in their hands. For though they fought in the name of unity, it was clear to any who looked closely that no two Primarchs were truly the same. They were not merely brothers. They were storms, each a different face of destiny, each leaving scars as deep as the victories they claimed. And in that truth lay the seed of dissonance, even amid the thunder of triumphs. To witness a Primarch wage war was to stand upon the edge of myth. The Great Crusade was not a campaign of ordinary conquest. It was a reordering of the galaxy itself, a hammerstroke delivered with the strength of gods. The Emperor's armies were vast, but it was the presence of his sons that made them unstoppable. For when a Primarch took to the field, he carried not only bolter and blade, but the weight of destiny itself. There are accounts from the ranks of the Astra military, brittle testimonies passed down like holy relics of the first sight of such beings. Soldiers who had cowered in trenches for weeks spoke of how the horizon seemed to ignite when a Primarch advanced. His stride unhurried yet unstoppable, each movement radiating authority so absolute it broke the will of entire armies. Against such a presence, Xenos champions who had stood unchallenged for centuries found themselves undone in a single duel. The clash of blade and armor, the roar of defiance, it was like hearing mountains split apart. The Legiones Astartes themselves, engineered as the most formidable warriors mankind had ever created, became something even greater when led by their genius. The warriors of the Lunar Wolves marched with a ferocity that mirrored Horus's brilliance, every maneuver flowing like an extension of his will. The Iron Hands fought with a cold, relentless rhythm that echoed Ferrus Manus's unyielding spirit, steel and flesh indistinguishable in their determination. The Blood Angels carried into battle the unshakable faith inspired by Sanguinius, their charge like a tide of red and gold that seemed unstoppable even in the face of annihilation. To fight under such command was to believe that defeat itself had been erased from possibility. Yet it was not only their followers who were transformed. The Primarchs themselves felt the intoxication of war, each victory affirming the destiny carved into their souls. For Guilliman, it was proof that order and vision could bind worlds into harmony. For Angron, it was the raw release of fury that had long been chained in the gladiatorial pits of his youth. For Kurz, it was a haunting reflection of the terror he believed necessary to enforce compliance. They were suns wielded as weapons, yet in every campaign they reshaped the very purpose of that weapon according to their own scars, their own desires. The galaxy trembled beneath them. Entire systems bent the knee after a single display of primarchal might, not from conviction but from awe and fear. To many mortals, the Primarchs were not sons of the Emperor at all, but deities in their own right. They prayed to them, carved their images into stone, whispered their names as if invoking blessings. This was devotion the Emperor never intended, yet it grew naturally, uncontrollably. For how could ordinary humans not worship such beings when their very presence blurred the line between man and God? And still, within the thunder of conquest, there was silence where disquiet hid. Not all victories were clean. Not all worlds submitted willingly. The scars left behind were not always mended by banners and anthems. Some whispered that the Primarchs were too much like the storms of the warp that had once claimed them beautiful. Terrible, unstoppable, but never entirely under control. The legions marched on regardless, banners unfurling beneath the light of distant suns, unaware that in their triumphs lay the seeds of the greatest war mankind would ever know. The Great Crusade rolled onward like a tide that could not be turned. System after system fell beneath the banners of the Aquila, their skies lit by firestorms as fleets descended, their rulers forced to kneel or burn. At the heart of this conquest were the Primarchs, each one the embodiment of a legion's soul, each one a weapon sharpened beyond mortal comprehension. To the Imperium, they were the Father's will made flesh. To the galaxy, they were thunder given form. Yet no thunder is the same. Each Primarch's presence bent the flow of war in ways unmistakable. Horus, the War Master, embodied not just command but charisma, so overwhelming that entire armies fought harder simply to remain worthy of his gaze. Worlds that might have resisted to the last instead surrendered when he spoke. swayed by the conviction that his cause was irresistible. In contrast, Perturabo brought not honeyed words, but iron fortresses. His campaigns etched into the bones of worlds as labyrinths of siege and counter-siege, leaving behind scars so deep they bled into eternity. The contrast of such sons was the paradox of the crusade itself, united beneath their father, yet fractured in the nature of their souls. For the mortals who bore witness, these contrasts were both blessing and curse. To march beneath Sanguinius was to feel one's spirit lifted by the grace of something more than human, as though even death and battle was transfigured into beauty. To march beneath Angron was to be hurled into carnage so unrelenting that survival itself felt like blasphemy. And yet both legions achieved victory. Both claimed worlds. Both expanded the reach of mankind's dominion. Victory was inevitable, but the cost of that victory carved itself into the hearts of the soldiers who followed. Even among the legions, doubt sometimes whispered. The Astartes were bred to obey, to revere their Primarchs as fathers, but obedience does not silence unease. Warriors who had seen their leaders split tanks apart with bare hands could not deny the awe such feats inspired. But awe is a double-edged thing. Some wondered, in the silence of barracks and the private sanctuaries of prayer, if these beings were truly meant to be servants of the Emperor, if they were gods in their own right, biding their time until even terror itself would bend. The Emperor's vision demanded unity, demanded that the Primarchs act as extensions of his will. Yet the truth was more fragile. For all their loyalty, for all their victories, his sons were not empty vessels. They were men of passions and pride, scarred by exile and shaped by worlds alien to one another. Every campaign, every conquest, strengthened not only the Imperium, but also the sense of independence burning within each Primarch's heart. They had ruled before their father came to claim them. They would not easily forget the taste of sovereignty, and so, even at the height of the Great Crusade, when the galaxy seemed at last within mankind's grasp, an unease lingered. Victories piled higher than mountains, but beneath them lay fractures invisible to those who sang hymns of triumph. The power of the Primarchs was undeniable. Their might unmatched, but it was also unpredictable. A living storm that could never truly be chained. It was in this paradox, the brilliance of conquest and the shadow of pride, that the seeds of betrayal took root. For the hammer of war, no matter how mighty, may one day fall not upon the galaxy, but upon itself. The galaxy burned with banners of triumph, yet beneath those banners the silence of doubt grew heavier. Victory had been won in 1,000 systems. The Imperium stretched across the stars, and the Primarchs stood as the shining exemplars of their father's dream. But no empire, however glorious, can silence the whispers of pride. No unity, however vast, can erase the scars of exile. The Primarchs, who had once marched shoulder to shoulder as brothers, began to feel the weight of their differences pressing like a blade at the seam of armor. It began subtly, in glances across strategium tables, in the unspoken dissonance of voices raised not against the enemy, but against each other. Perturabo, bitter in the shadow of unrecognized genius, bristled at dawn, whose fortresses were lauded while his own masterpieces were dismissed. Fulgrim, entranced by the pursuit of perfection, could not see eye to eye with Mortarion, who scorned decadence as weakness. Kurz, haunted by visions of the Imperium's decay, stood isolated, his brothers recoiling from the darkness that bled from his words. They were still united in conquest, still instruments of the Emperor's will, but already the cracks ran deep. The mortal legions saw it too, though few dared to speak aloud. soldiers who marched beneath the banners of different Primarchs learned quickly that each legion carried not just a style of war, but an identity as unyielding as iron. The Lunar Wolves strode with unmatched confidence, certain that their War Master's brilliance would never falter. The Iron Warriors fought with grim, grinding inevitability, as though every battle was another stone laid in a wall of unending attrition. The Night Lords fought not merely to win, but to terrify, their campaigns echoing the savagery of their father's fractured soul. These were not simply armies of the same Imperium. They were reflections of the men who led them on, those reflections rarely aligned. And still, above them all, the Emperor watched. His silence was more terrible than any rebuke, for he was not a man given to explanation. His plans were vast, his vision unknowable even to those who bore his blood. He demanded loyalty, but rarely offered the intimacy his sons craved. To some, that distance became a wound that festered with every campaign. To others, it was a challenge to prove themselves greater, to earn a sliver of recognition from the father who had built them for purpose, but withheld the warmth of love. It is said that Horus, alone, for a time, bridged that silence. His bond with the Emperor was deep enough to inspire envy, for in him others saw the reflection of what they longed for and would never have. To some, it was proof that loyalty brought reward. To others, it was the spark of jealousy that gnawed silently at the foundations of brotherhood, and through it all, the warp whispered. Dreams darkened, omens multiplied, and the same power that had scattered them as children now pressed against their souls like a predator circling its prey. The victories of the Great Crusade drowned those whispers for a time, but no victory lasts forever. For the greatest enemies of the Primarchs were never only the alien or the heretic. Their greatest enemies were pride, envy, and the shadows seeded in their hearts when the warp first tore them from their father's arms. The foundations of thrones had been laid, but thrones are brittle things when built upon fractures. The silence of unease soon gave way to storms of open tension. What had once been whispered doubts among the sons of the Emperor began to shape the very air of war councils. The Primarchs stood like towering statues carved from different stones, their voices resonant, their words weighted with pride, and it was clear that unity could not silence the distinctions of their birth. The Emperor had cast his children across the galaxy, each to be tempered in fire, frost, or shadow. And now those temperings came to clash like steel against steel on one world. Fulgrim's pursuit of artistry and refinement made his legion gleam like jeweled blades. Yet to Mortarion, such flourish was a sickness, an indulgence unfit for warriors of truth and hardship. Their words cut sharper than their swords, brother against brother, as visions of what it meant to embody the emperors will diverge beyond reconciliation. Perturabo, who built fortresses that could outlast the age of suns, looked upon dawn and saw nothing but favoritism, his brilliance overshadowed by praise he believed undeserved. And Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, mocked Kersey's morbid severity, only to find in those pale eyes the reflection of doom itself. Visions of betrayal and ruin painted across the stars. To the mortals who followed them, such fractures were terrifying. For how could gods quarrel? To see brothers in arms dispute strategy with a ferocity equal to their campaigns was to glimpse the truth that no empire rests solely on banners. Some soldiers whispered their doubts in the privacy of barracks, that if these beings could not agree, then surely doom awaited the Imperium. Others clung to faith, insisting that even gods must test each other's strength. That rivalry was but another crucible through which unity would be forged. Yet the undercurrent of fear never vanished. The Emperor's absence deepened the wounds. For as the crusade thundered forward, he grew ever more distant. Consumed by his great work upon terror, his silence was filled instead by the voices of his sons. And those voices rarely sang the same hymn. Horus, elevated above them as War Master, sought to hold the bonds together, his charisma and brilliance binding for a time what pride threatened to tear apart. But even his presence could not smother envy entirely. Why him? Why not another? That question hung unspoken in the minds of many, festering in silence. And beyond it all, unseen but ever present, the warp continued its patient work. Nightmares grew sharper, omens more frequent. The veil between reality and madness seemed thinner around certain Primarchs, as though the very power that had once scattered them now reached out to stir the embers of discontent. Some sons dismissed these visions as madness. Others saw in them the shape of truths too terrible to deny. But whether ignored or embraced, the whispers found their way into every heart. What the galaxy could not see, what the legions dared not admit, was that the unity of the Primarchs was already cracking. The victories they won were brilliant, yes, but the fractures beneath were like hairline breaks in a great statue, imperceptible at first, but destined to split the moment pressure grew too great. And the pressure was rising, unseen, unstoppable. The thrones they built were no longer seats of triumph. They were fractures clothed in gold, waiting for the weight of betrayal. The dream of unity faltered in ways too subtle for mortals to see. But to the sons of the Emperor, it was a wound that bled each day. Every triumph of the Great Crusade only sharpened the contrast between them. Every conquest another chance for pride to swell and bitterness to deepen. What had begun as friction now burned hotter, fanned by jealousy and the gnawing hunger for recognition. The Emperor had created gods, but gods cannot share dominion without suspicion. Perturbo's resentment festered with every fortress praised in Dawn's name. His iron warriors ground their enemies into dust, but the accolades drifted elsewhere, leaving him with laurels of ash. Angron's fury grew unchecked, his campaign's victories by attrition that left oceans of blood in their wake. And still he felt the Emperor's disdain, as if no triumph could ever erase the chains of his gladiatorial youth. Kurz wandered further into shadows, his visions of doom unrelenting, his brothers recoiling from the stench of prophecy that poured from his lips. He whispered that the Imperium was not salvation, but tyranny dressed in banners. And though none admitted belief, some felt his words gnaw in the silence of their own doubts. Horus, the War Master, still bound them for a time. His charisma soothed wounds, his victories shone as beacons, his presence a reminder of what unity might yet achieve. He was the star around which the others circled, the bridge between their pride and their loyalty. Yet even a star burns its fuel, and envy is a hunger that cannot be fed. Whispers wound their way through the legions. Why Horus? Why not Guilliman, the architect of order? Why not Dawn, whose loyalty was unshakable? Why not Sanguinius, whose very presence inspired the devotion of millions? Horus's elevation was meant to unify, but it seeded a silent rivalry that no oath could erase. The mortals in the ranks felt the tremors long before the collapse. To them, the Primarchs were titans, yet titans at odds. They witnessed their lords clash in councils with words that cut deeper than swords, saw the cold glares across tables where strategies were drawn. Soldiers whispered of battles won not against Xenos, but against the pride of brothers, victories hollowed by the tension that lingered long after banners were raised. Some spoke in awe, others in fear, but none could deny that the Imperium's greatest strength was also its most fragile fault line, and the warp, patient and eternal, pressed ever closer. In the silence of dreams, in the echo of battles, its whispers grew clearer. It spoke to wounds already open, to pride already wounded, to fear already alive. It did not invent the fractures. It merely widened them, its shadow slipping between words, twisting loyalties, reshaping doubt into conviction. For the warp is not creation, it is reflection, magnifying what already dwells in the heart until it consumes all else. The Emperor's absence made the cracks a chasm. He labored in secrecy upon terror, his sons left to bear the burden of conquest without the light of his direct command. And in that void, mistrust flourished. They were not merely brothers estranged by pride. They were sovereigns, cloaked as sons, each carrying within him the echo of worlds where he had ruled alone. To ask such beings to kneel forever was to ask the storm to bow to the mountain. Thus, the thrones they built, forged in glory and conquest, became seats of fracture. The Imperium stood vast, victorious, radiant across the stars, but its foundation was a family already divided, and families divided do not endure, and soon the weight of betrayal would come, not from without, but from within. The fall of brotherhood was not sudden. It was a slow uncoiling, like a serpent moving beneath the grass, unseen until its fangs were already at the throat. The Imperium, so vast that its banners reached from one edge of the galaxy to the other, seemed unbreakable. Yet beneath the triumphs and hymns, beneath the endless victories carved into stone and scripture, there lay a silence that trembled with coming ruin. For the power of the Primarchs, once humanity's greatest weapon, was now turning inward toward doubt, ambition, and despair. When Horus fell to corruption, it was not merely a single soul undone, but the sundering of a vision that had bound countless worlds. He had been the brightest, the most beloved, the one who carried the Emperor's trust like a mantle of light. His betrayal was not only a wound, it was a shattering. If Horus could fall, then what certainty remained? Legions, once united, became divided overnight, some following their father, others following their brother into the abyss, and those who remained loyal carried forever the scars of knowing that the hand raised against them was the hand they had once sworn to follow into fire. The battlefields of the heresy became nightmares beyond imagining. Where once Primarchs had stood side by side as invincible bulwarks, now they clashed with fury so apocalyptic that entire worlds crumbled beneath their wrath. Titan clashed with Titan, brother with brother, and the very air seemed to scream with the weight of betrayal. Mortals caught between them could scarcely comprehend what they witnessed. To see a Primarch unleashed in battle was awe beyond words. But to see two Primarchs collide was terror that stripped hope from the soul. These were not wars of strategy alone. They were storms that tore at the fabric of reality itself. Yet the ruin was not only physical, it was spiritual, searing itself into the hearts of humanity. Worlds that had once seen their saviors as gods now saw them as demons, beings of immeasurable power who could just as easily annihilate as protect. The line between divinity and damnation blurred, and whispers spread through the ranks that perhaps the Primarchs had never been meant to be mankind's shepherds. Perhaps they were only ever the tools of powers greater than themselves, pawns moved across a board by the Emperor, by the warp, or by the cruel laughter of fate itself. Still, amid the chaos, loyalty endured. Some sons clung to their father with desperate conviction, fighting not only for the Imperium but for the idea that their brotherhood had once represented. Sanguinius stood as the radiant example of this faith, his wings blazing even in the face of despair, his sacrifice a testament that loyalty could still mean something in the ruins of trust. Dawn defended Terra with a resolve as immovable as stone, even as grief gnawed at him with every brother lost. Guilliman, though shattered by the betrayal, clung to order as if it were the last weapon left against chaos. They fought not merely against their traitor brothers, but against the collapse of the very dream that had once bound them together. But the galaxy does not forgive. The scars of the heresy were not wounds that time could close. They became legacies, etched into the very bones of the Imperium. And though the war ended, its ruin echoed still. For the godlike power of the Primarchs had shown humanity both its highest hope and its deepest damnation. The Horus heresy ended in fire and sorrow, but endings in the Imperium are never clean. The siege of Terra, the clash of titans upon the walls of the cradle of mankind, was not only a battle for survival, but a revelation of how fragile even godlike beings could be. The Emperor himself, enthroned in golden radiance, stood against his most beloved son, and in that duel all illusions shattered. If a Primarch could rise against his will, if a son could strike the father, then what hope could remain untainted? Victory came, but it was hollow, for the cost was greater than the Imperium could ever repay. The Emperor was broken, entombed within the golden throne, his voice silenced except through the Astronomican's eternal beacon. Humanity had triumphed, yes, but at a price that tasted like ashes. The surviving Primarchs carried that ruin with them, each in his own way. Some clung to their legions, binding themselves more tightly to duty in order to mask the emptiness within. Others withdrew, consumed by grief or guilt, their presence fading like echoes in a vast, empty hall. Guilliman, struck down and sealed in stasis, became a symbol of the Imperium's stagnation. Dawn buried himself in fortifications, building walls as if stone could shield him from sorrow. Vulcan wandered his path more myth than fact, a reminder that hope itself might become a rumor. Each surviving son carried the weight of a galaxy's broken faith, and none escaped unscarred. For the traitor Primarchs, the path was darker still. Those who had turned from the Emperorâ found themselves bound not to freedom, but to chains of another kind. The powers of the warp, eager and insatiable, claimed their loyalty in full. Some ascended into monstrous forms, their humanity dissolved into the shapes of gods and beasts. Others lingered as exiles, hated by those they once called brothers, their legions cursed and driven into the shadows. They had traded one master for another, and though their power grew, it was a power steeped in corruption and eternal hunger. The galaxy would never forget their betrayal, nor forgive it. And yet, for mortals who lived in the shadow of these beings, the memory of the heresy was not only a tale of despair. It became scripture, myth, a lesson carved into the marrow of mankind. To the faithful, it was proof of the Emperor's sacrifice, his endurance beyond death, his unyielding light in the face of treachery. To others, it was a warning that no being, no matter how divine, was free from corruption. Across the Imperium, shrines rose to the loyal sons, their names invoked in prayer, while curses were spat at the traitor's memory. The heresy became more than history. It became identity, but history is a wound, and wounds do not heal cleanly. Every chant of devotion carried an undertone of grief. Every statue of a loyal son stood beside the shadow of a brother lost. Humanity had seen what it meant for the godlike power of a Primarch to be fully unleashed, and it could no longer pretend that such power was a simple gift. It was a curse as much as it was a blessing. It had brought unity, and it had brought ruin. And in the long silence that followed, the galaxy learned the cruelest truth. Legacies do not die. They echo. The echoes of the Primarchs lingered long after their footsteps vanished from the battlefields of the galaxy. Some were gone, slain in duels that shook the stars. Others withdrew into silence, their fates whispered more as rumor than fact. A few rose into immortal monstrosities, their souls claimed by the churning madness of the warp. Yet whether loyal or traitor, present or absent, the legacy of the Emperor's sons did not fade. It became the marrow of the Imperium, shaping not only its wars, but its very identity. For the Imperium, the memory of the loyal Primarchs became a lifeline in an age defined by decline. Their deeds were recounted in scripture, their visages carved into cathedral walls, their sacrifices sung by billions, whose lips would never pronounce their names correctly, but whose faith was unshakable. To invoke Sanguinius was to speak of angelic sacrifice. To whisper Dawn's name was to recall duty unbroken by despair. Even Guilliman, once entombed in stasis, was revered as a promise that order might one day return. They became more than generals, more than sons. They became myths, standing as lighthouses in a sea of darkness. Even when their hands no longer guided the helm, but myths are. For the traitor Primarchs, too, left legacies that could not be ignored. The galaxy still trembled at the names of Angron, Fulgrim, and Lorgar. Their deeds remembered not as warnings, but as wounds that never healed. Their corruption echoed in their legions, in the cults that whispered their praises across 1,000 corrupted worlds, in the demonic forms they now wore as mockeries of the humanity they once embodied. To the Imperium, they were the great betrayers, cursed eternally. Yet even curses carry weight, and their shadows stretched long across the centuries, feeding rebellions, stoking heresies, reminding the Imperium that the line between godhood and damnation is thin as a blade's edge. Mortals could never forget what they had seen. For those who had fought beside the Primarchs, or against them, or simply lived beneath the planets their wrath had touched, the memories burned too deeply. The thunder of their footsteps, the brilliance of their wrath, the awe of their presence, all of it lingered. To live in such a time was to stand in the light of Titans, and no later age could erase the memory. Even now, 10,000 years later, men whisper their names as though speaking of saints or devils. For there is no middle ground when recalling the godlike power of a Primarch unleashed. And what of the Emperor? He endures, silent upon the golden throne, his will radiating as the Astronomican's eternal flame. Some say he sacrificed his sons willingly, knowing that their fall was inevitable. Others claim that even he, the greatest of all minds, had not foreseen how swiftly pride and pain could tear a family apart. In the chants of the ecclesiarchy, the Primarchs are described as proof of his genius and the price of his vision. But in the private prayers of soldiers and civilians alike, there lingers another truth, that the Emperor's dream was written not only in gold, but in blood, and it was his sons who bled the deepest. The legacy of the Primarchs is not unity, nor is it ruin. It is both. They were humanity's greatest hope and its most terrible curse. Their names immortal not because they endured, but because their impact was too vast to ever be forgotten. And though centuries blur and myths grow heavier with each retelling, the truth remains sharp enough to wound when the power of a Primarch is unleashed. The galaxy itself has changed forever, and nothing, neither gods nor men, can escape the echoes.